Hey everybody, and we're back. This is How to Read the Bible, a field guide for spotting Jesus in every book of the Bible. And just as a heads up, if you're watching live on Facebook or on any other way, all of these videos are stored at youtube.com/EncounterChurchOnline. I'll put a link below, but you can check it out. What we're doing is we're going through the entire Bible, a book at a time, to see how the whole thing holds together and how every single book of the Bible, along with chapter in the Bible, verse, and word, points towards Jesus. And so this time is a field guide for spotting Jesus in every book of the Bible. Today, we are looking at the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now, I said book there because it's actually just one book. Originally, it was just Samuel, and we put those together as 1st and 2nd Samuel because scrolls just weren't that long way back in the day, and so they broke it up into two scrolls, first and second parts. But really, it's one story told over a number of chapters. It's a longer book as you put it together, so we'll just jump in. As a refresher and reminder, why this study is that the Bible is written over thousands of years by dozens of authors on multiple continents, yet it has just one author and one purpose, and we learn about that author and that purpose together, and this time Wednesday at noon every single week to hear about how the Bible points its way towards Jesus. So let's take a look at 1st and 2nd Samuel. If you're in a group setting, you can go ahead and hit pause as usual and talk about 1st and 2nd Samuel, or the book of Samuel. What do you know about it? What happened? Who's in it? When did it happen? List as many facts as you can. I'm going to head on down here to start hearing a little bit more about Samuel. Like I said, originally it was just Samuel. It wasn't 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're separated books because it was long. No other reason than that. After Israel was rescued, this is kind of like setting the stage for Samuel. Is after Israel was rescued from Egypt, they made a covenant or a contract with God at Sinai before entering the promised land. You know, that was important because that's their understanding of, hey, listen, we are there as a people. We're going to follow your rules, God, and you will be our God, and you'll take care of us, and you'll see us through. That was the covenant. That was the contract that they had established. But of course, they didn't do that. They were supposed to obey the covenant commands, but they didn't. Now, just before Samuel, remember, we had Ruth last time, which was like this individual story about how God was working behind the scenes the whole time. But Ruth took place in the nation of Israel, this collective identity, the time period known as the time of the Judges. Now, the Judges was just an awful time to be around. The Judges really showed their massive and utter failing, this moral chaos, this descent into just really a horrible understanding and a horrible perspective for the nation. And it really showed the need, if anything else, by the time you get to the ending of Judges, which in that video I ended it with just saying, like, I'm not even going to talk about the last few chapters of Judges because it's so bad and it's so raunchy. It's so awful. We don't even want to go there. But what that did do for us, though, is it showed the need for Israel to have really better and wise leaders. And that's what sets us up for the book of Samuel. Samuel has three main characters. It has Samuel, the one that it's named after. It has Saul, and it has David. Just three main characters. That's all. And we'll see that they'll be pretty important a little bit later on. Samuel, in a broad sense, this is kind of like historically, they're transitioning as a nation. They're transitioning to kind of affiliated tribes or confederated kind of state groups held together to a unified kingdom, to really what we think of today as a people, one people, as a nation. Samuel is broken up into four parts. And I just want to show, this is from the Bible Project, and I think it's kind of helpful just to see what those four parts are. And you can see the chapters split out there. Two main parts, obviously 1st and 2nd Samuel, but remember it's just one book broken up because of scroll length. And you can see the chapters broken up there. At the very beginning, chapters 1 through 7, there's nothing there. That's kind of a prologue to the entire book. That's going to be really important because that's going to tell us actually what the whole book is going to be about. And then the rest of 1 Samuel is the first arc there is the rise and fall and eventually death, that's that splatter mark, of Saul. And then the second arc there is the rise and eventually fall and destruction of David, King David. And then at the very, very end, 2 Samuel 21 through 24 is the epilogue. And that's going to see, it's going to loop back to what happens in that prologue. So the very, very beginning of the book. Church, it's so important. Let's check out that first part there. And I'll just leave that graphic up on the screen so you can kind of follow along. Part 1, in that first panel, we see that Hannah is finally, she's barren. She can't have kids. Finally, though, after a huge amount of prayer, she finally has a son named Samuel. And Hannah offers up this prayer that's so incredibly important. It actually sets the tone, sets the verse for the dozens and dozens of chapters that are going to follow next. That prayer has 3 elements. It's really important for understanding the point of Samuel and then also the point for us in our weeks ahead. The first point is that God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. Now, you think that she's just talking about herself because she couldn't have kids, and in that day and age, it was really kind of a social outcast thing and like put her on the outs, so she had not much to be proud of. We think that she's talking about her, but actually she's talking about the whole nation. She's talking about the whole world. She's talking about creation itself. God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. She also says that despite all the evil in the world, much of it, all of it, is caused by fallen human beings. Despite all this evil, that God is still at work. And number 3, she kind of throws up there that God is going to raise up a king. Now, those three items that she prays about are going to keep coming up throughout this entire 2 books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Okay, and then you start off the book in Samuel and that prologue there, still in chapters 1 through 7, where the Israelites get into this skirmish, this fight with the nation of the Philistines next door. And the people think that God can be like this trophy, and so that they like pull out the Ark of the Covenant, which symbolizes God's presence, and said, hey, of course we're not going to lose if we've got God right here on the battle with us. Well, the story doesn't really go along that way. That the Philistines defeat the Israelites, they take the Ark and they put it in their temple of Dagon. Well, and then if you know the story, and if you want to read it, 1 Samuel 1 through 7, you can see that even though there's no army around from the Israel, every time the Philistines go to worship Dagon, and Yahweh is kind of like next door, Dagon is like down, he's bowed, he's broken up. Somehow Yahweh, the God of the Israelite people, the God of us today, defeats Dagon even without an army. And what do we learn by that? Well, the author tells us, remember, that God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, that despite all the evil caused by people, God is still at work, and that God will raise up a king. All right, now that's the prologue, the first panel there. Now we have part 2 is chapters 8 through 31, the second part of 1 Samuel. The people, they want a king. They want to be like everybody else. Remember the refrain from Judges in those days, Israel had no king, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Well, this is our solution. We're going to get a king. Samuel says, this is really not a good idea, but he consults with God, and God says, yeah, no, that's not a good idea, but okay, let's do it. It'll be part of my redemptive plan. And so they come up with Saul. Now, the tragedy of Saul is that he's got so much promise. He's tall, he's handsome, but he also has these really deep character flaws that we also find out. He's dishonest, he's prideful, he lacks integrity, and probably the most important character flaw or defect with Saul is that he lacks remorse. And that's the big thing, right? Especially with our faith today. It's not so much about being perfect. It's about owning your imperfection. Whatever you confess to God, you'll be forgiven for. But whatever you fail to confess to God and repent over, you'll be held accountable for it. That is the irony of the story of the Christian story. All right. Samuel, he confronts Saul this one time and says, hey, listen, you're out of line here. You did some things, consulted this sorcerer. And Saul fails to repent, right? Because that's what his deep character flaw is. And so Samuel says that now God will raise up a new king. And so we have David, the shepherd boy. On the graph above, you can start to see, okay, we're kind of in that midpoint, the apex of that arc of Saul and the very beginning of David. He's not a king. He's not anywhere close to it. In fact, he's more like a shepherd boy than he is a king. But the Goliath story is such a perfect story because we see that David, even though he's just a shepherd boy, he's exemplifying these three attributes. That God opposes the proud, he exalts the humble, especially the youngest born of Jesse, who's got so many other more able kids. But God opposes the proud and the able, and he exalts the humble. And despite all of the evil that's going on with Goliath standing right in front of him, God is still at work, and that God will raise up a new king. And now we start to see the rise, significant rise of David. David rising up, and we see on that arc there, David is going up and Saul is going down. David has this multi-decade period of being the king anointed. It's kind of like being the president-elect, only this doesn't last for months. This lasts for decades and decades. It goes on and on and on, where David knows that he's the next king. He's been anointed as the next king, but yet Saul is in charge. David has all of these opportunities to end this once and for all, to kill Saul, to be done with it, and to move on, to take his throne, but he doesn't do it. And so he exemplifies that humble obedience to God in all things. And so we can see that David's patience really equals trust. Again and again. Don't forget, again, it's Hannah's prayer lived out in David. As a fun side note, most of David's Psalms, he wrote a ton of these songs in the middle of your Bible. It's Psalms. Most of these were written around this time period and also around this theme about opposing the proud. God is at work and he's raising up a king. Psalm 18, 23, 52, 53, 57, and so on. There's a lot of them. Well, eventually, we see that big splat to the graph next to me. Eventually, Saul dies a very gruesome death in battle. And so the author here at the conclusion of 1 Samuel kind of invites us to do just kind of like a character check-in or a character study to reflect on the two kings, Saul and David, but also more pointedly to reflect on our lives, right? Who do we exemplify more? Do we align ourselves with David, exalting the humble, opposing the proud, or more like Saul? Saul kind of equals the pride. David sort of equals patience or trust that God is in charge. Start 2 Samuel, chapter 1 through 20, part 3. It's that first pane to the one, or the fourth pane next to me, the first one of 2 Samuel, the panes 1 and 2. Same book, don't forget. David, it opens again with humility because God opposes the proud. Hannah's prayer, going way back to the prologue originally. David is mourning the death of his bitter enemy who tried to kill him on countless occasions, Saul. Right off the bat, we see David being blessed. He's united the nation. He's coming together. Key chapter. One of the most important chapters in the entire Bible, certainly the Old Testament, 2 Samuel chapter 7. David comes up to God and says, God, the nation now has this permanent home or a unified kingdom. We have a capital city in Jerusalem. Now, God, it's time for you to have a permanent home. No longer are we going to have this traveling God's presence tent tabernacle thing. I want to build you a temple. And God says, thanks, but no thanks. But David, I would like to do something permanent for you. You are going to have a house too. In fact, by house, he means a dynasty. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, we have this covenant or this promise to David that says somebody from your line is going to sit on the throne of Israel forever and ever and ever and ever. And he will rule not just over Israel, but over all nations, the whole world. Now, he had no idea what God was meaning behind that. And it's just kind of tossed out there. And David's thinking, wow, that's a really generous promise of God. What do I have to do? This is important. What do I have to do to ensure that your word is true, that somebody from my line is going to sit on the throne of the nations forever and ever? And unlike Sinai, God says, don't worry about it. I've got this covered. This isn't a kind of contract or covenant where you do this for me, obedience, and I'll take care of you. This is something else entirely. This is something that I'm unilaterally going to do for you. It's happening. And what we look back and why we view that as so important in the Christian faith and the story of God in the Bible is 2 Samuel chapter 7 represents the messianic promise. That promise that Jesus will come as king and sit on the throne forever and ever. Immediately after that, David makes a fatal mistake. Not fatal so much for David, but fatal for his mistress's husband, Uriah. David has an affair with Bathsheba. Uriah is murdered as a result. Bathsheba's husband, David marries Bathsheba. Listen, it's bad. It's really bad. Nathan, the prophet now, not Samuel, confronts David. And unlike the time that Samuel confronted Saul, and Saul said, hey, I didn't do anything wrong. My business is my business. This time, David repents. I am so sorry. He writes in one of those Psalms that I mentioned earlier, broken and contrite heart, Lord, you will not despise. You will not turn away. And God gives him forgiveness, but the consequence of his mistake remains. And I think that's the part of sin, and maybe we just don't quite realize today, that God gives us forgiveness upon forgiveness. I mean, grace upon grace, over and over and over. It's as huge and vast as an ocean. But it doesn't mean that he allows us to escape the consequences of our mistakes, right? There's all kinds of things that maybe we would do, like the affair that David has with Bathsheba. And even though he's forgiven for it, there's consequences of that just play themselves out. God embedded this into creation in order to help us learn. Just like a child touches a hot stove, gets burned, that child knows, don't touch it. It's going to hurt me. It's not good for me anymore. And so he learns not to do that again. Well, that's embedded into creation as well. The consequences of sin that we might experience aren't punishment. Jesus paid the punishment on the cross. The consequences are sinners so that we would learn not to do that anymore. And the consequences that David experiences is that his children repeat those mistakes. You can look up the story of Tamar, Amnon, Absalom. It's 3 kids where Amnon attacks Tamar, Absalom attacks Amnon, and then Absalom starts a rebellion against David. And it's like this civil war breaks out. David has to flee. Eventually, Absalom gets himself killed, but it's also not just the person who's leading that rebellion, Absalom. It's also David's son. And so he's mourning. He's broken up. He just lost his son twice. Once because he tried to kill his dad and take his kingdom. The second time because he died. David ends up back on the throne, but this time entirely broken-hearted. This is the time that we see that kind of crash down into that second to last pain under David, where the story it ends on a kind of a sad note for David. There's all these stories about his heroic conquest, and this is the opposite of that. It ends kind of on a depressing note for David, but he's back on the throne. And then the last pain, part 4, 21 to 24, is the epilogue. A look back. What was this story that we just read about? Well, it's not organized chronologically. It's organized thematically. What we see below is called a chiastic structure. That's a structure that's used a ton of times in the Bible over and over is a helpful way to remember it, where you say something, say the most important thing, and then say the thing that was said originally backwards, the opposite. This time we have this epilogue begins with the failure of Saul. Then we go to a story of David's mighty men when they were strong. In the middle, we have, I'll just kind of tab it in there, the memoirs of David, which we'll get to in just a minute. Now, kind of going along with the story of David's mighty men where they're strong, there's a story of David and his mighty men where they're weak. And then to kind of go along with the failure of Saul, we see it ends with a failure of David. You can kind of see how that is organized there, right? Well, what do we learn here? The most important thing is what's happening in the center
of the chiastic structure. Chiastic is an X, so they kind of see how that sort of starts to look like an X. In the memoirs are all about God's grace, God's promises, and God's promise for a future king. What does that remind us of? It reminds us not just the epilogue, but the prologue. Way back in the beginning, not of 2 Samuel, it's one book, way back in the beginning of 1 Samuel 1 through 7. Hannah's prayer, where God opposes the proud, exalts the humble. That's God's grace, where despite all the evil in the world, God is still at work. God's promises, and that God will raise up a king, God's future king. It's one book. It's all being held together. It's 55 chapters long, spanning multiple kings, multiple prophets, a nation that comes together from tribes into a united nation. So much content, so much story being covered here, but yet this whole thing points us to this one singular purpose. Key passage, if you're looking for some Bible memory on here, 2 Samuel 7:16. I think this is one of the most important verses in the entire Old Testament, where God is talking to David, and he says, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." And it was. That's what we're celebrating this Christmas. Matthew chapter 1 opens with a very long genealogy that, yes, includes David in it, because Jesus is the fulfillment of that promise to sit on the throne, to reign on the throne forever and ever. Theme of the book, come on, it's Hannah's prayer. God opposes the proud, exalts the humble. Despite the evil, God is still at work, and that God will raise up a king. That's the promise. Spotting Jesus in 1 and 2 Samuel, it shouldn't be that hard for us. This whole thing is like just crying out for a better and a true king, a king who will rule with integrity, with honesty, with grace and mercies, that God brought a better and true once and for all king who opposed the proud, redeemed evil, and all the evil that he suffered on the cross, and reigns as king on the throne of all nations forever and ever. All right, church, I included some group questions right here. If you're in a group setting, you can go ahead and hit pause and discuss them for a little while. If you're watching online, thank you so much for spending a tiny bit of your afternoon with me. We'll see you next time for a study of 1st and 2nd Kings.